I've been a trucker for close to 20 years now, and in that time, I've seen some pretty strange things on the road, but nothing compares to what happened to me back in 2009. It was a hot, suffocating night, and I was hauling a load through the Great Basin Desert in California, heading toward Utah, one of those overnight drives where the darkness feels almost alive, like it's pressing in on you from every direction. My headlights were dim, something I'd been meaning to fix but never got around to. Usually I could manage. But out there in the desert, with no other cars around, it felt like I was driving into a black hole. The road stretched out in front of me, a straight line that seemed to disappear into nothing. I was starting to think about pulling over, waiting for the first hints of sunrise. But I desperately needed the money, and stopping would mean losing precious time. So, I pushed on, even though I knew it wasn't the smartest choice. The desert was unnervingly quiet, with only the low hum of my engine to break the silence. It was the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of everything, every shadow, every flicker of movement in the corner of your eye. I was starting to feel uneasy, a creeping sense of dread that I couldn't quite shake, when I noticed something up ahead. At first, it was just a shape in the distance, barely distinguishable in the gloom, but as I got closer, it became clear. It was a car, sitting dead center, in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my truck screeching to a stop just inches from the rear bumper. The car wasn't just idling there. It was completely still, its hazard lights flashing in the blackness. I sat there for a moment, the only sound of the rapid thud of my heartbeat in my ears, staring at the car, wondering who in their right mind would leave it like that, in the middle of nowhere. The car was a red Ford Fusion, its hazards blinking in the darkness like a warning. The strangest thing, though, was that it was parked directly on the double yellow lines, with its passenger door wide open, almost as if someone had left in a hurry. I'm not the kind of guy who scares easily, so I shook off the unease creeping up my spine and got out of my truck, figuring someone might need help. As I walked closer, my boots crunching on the gravel, I began to notice just how quiet it was out there. The kind of quiet that almost hums in your ears, broken only by the steady ticking of the hazard lights. I peered into the car, half expecting to see someone slumped over the wheel or maybe lying across the back seat. But the car was completely empty. The key was still in the ignition, but the engine was off, leaving me with a growing sense of something being very, very wrong. A cold chill crept up my spine as I opened the back door, almost expecting someone to lunge at me from the shadows. But again, nothing. Just empty seats and that oppressive silence. I stood there for a moment, my breath clouding in the cold night air, trying to make sense of it. That's when I noticed the trunk. It was shut tight, too tight, almost as if it was sealed from the inside. My curiosity got the better of me. I knew I should have just walked away, got back in my truck, and left it all behind. But something about that trunk called to me. I tried opening it, but it wouldn't budge. Frustrated, and now more than a little on edge, I went back to the front, grabbed the keys, and unlocked the trunk from inside. With some effort, I finally got it open. My heart skipped a beat when I saw what was inside. 3 garbage bags, squished together, along with a rope tied hastily to keep them from spilling out. The bags looked odd, bulging in unnatural shapes that made my stomach churn. I leaned in closer, holding my breath, when suddenly, a gunshot rang out, shattering the silence. The sound was so loud, so close. It felt like it had ripped through me. I jolted up, slamming my head against the roof of the car. Panic surged through me as I realized what was happening. I tossed the keys onto the front seat, not caring where they landed, and bolted back to my truck, my heart pounding in my chest. As I fumbled to climb inside, I heard a voice. A gruff, gravelly yell, cutting through the darkness. The voice was getting closer, each word making my blood run colder. I barely got my truck started before I saw him, a tall guy with no hair standing by the trunk of the car. He was holding a shovel in one hand and a hunting rifle in the other. Our eyes locked for a split second, and in that moment I saw something in his expression that caught me off guard. It wasn't anger or rage, but a look of pure worry, like he was more afraid of what I might do than anything else. He started waving his hands frantically, shouting for me to stop, but there was no way I was sticking around to find out what he wanted. I slammed my foot on the gas, my heart pounding in my chest as the truck roared to life. In the rearview mirror, I saw him running after me for a few steps before turning back to his car. I thought I was in the clear, that I could just leave this whole bizarre encounter behind, but then I noticed the headlights in the distance. Getting closer, too close. It was him, tailing me, honking his horn like a madman. Panic surged through me as I realized he wasn't going to let this go. I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling as I called the police. I tried to explain what was happening, but before they could even respond, the guy sped up, cutting in front of me, forcing me to slam on the brakes. My truck screeched to a halt just inches from his bumper, and for a moment, I was sure I was about to crash. Just when I thought it was all over, flashing police lights appeared on the horizon. Relief washed over me as the guy veered off the road, speeding into the desert and disappearing into the night. When the cop finally reached me, I tried to explain what had happened, my words tumbling out in a frantic mess. But instead of chasing after the guy, he just nodded, took my statement, and sent me on my way, saying they'd look into it. I never heard anything more about it. No calls, no follow-up, nothing. It was like the whole thing had never happened. But I know what I saw, and I know that guy was desperate for some reason, desperate enough to chase down a trucker in the middle of the desert. To this day, I don't know what he was doing out there, or why he was so desperate to stop me. My buddies think he might have been burying something or someone. But for my own sanity, I try not to dwell on it. I've told the story more times than I can count, but I never stick around to hear the theories people come up with. All I know is that ever since that night, I've never felt comfortable driving through the desert in the dark. Every time I'm out there, I can't help but feel like someone's watching, waiting just beyond the reach of my dim headlights. I started driving trucks about 2 years ago, not exactly where I thought I'd end up after leaving behind a prestigious university, but life has a way of surprising you. Trucking isn't a bad gig, though. The money's decent, and there's a certain peace to the solitude of the open road, but those long hours, those endless stretches of highway with nothing but your thoughts, can really mess with your head. You don't realize how much the isolation will get to you until you're out there, miles from anywhere, with only your own mind for company. I learned fast that if you've got any demons lurking inside you, they'll find their way out in those quiet, lonely hours. It was about 4 months into the job, and I was still green, trying to figure out the ropes. One night, I was on a long haul from West Pennsylvania to South Bend, Indiana. A 12-hour drive straight through, and I'd just come off an 8-hour trip before that. I was pushing myself hard, trying to make good time. But halfway through, I realized I was out of Red Bull. Rookie mistake. I hated stopping during a run because the second I took my foot off the gas, the exhaustion would hit me like a sledgehammer. But I knew I didn't have a choice. Either pull over and grab something to keep me awake or risk dozing off at the wheel. I decided to pull over at the first place I found. I pulled into what I thought was a service stop, hoping for a quick break to refuel my energy. But as I slowed down and the building came into focus, I realized it wasn't the kind of place you'd want to stop at in the dead of night. The gas station was clearly abandoned, paint peeling off the walls, windows clouded with grime, and a flickering neon sign that hadn't worked properly in years. The convenience store beside it looked like it had been repurposed, but for what? I couldn't tell. I parked my truck and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots as I made my way to the convenience store. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I was greeted by a wave of pitch-black darkness. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust, and as they did, I noticed a faint, eerie glow coming from the back of the store. Something about it felt off. But curiosity got the better of me. I walked slowly toward the light, every instinct telling me to turn around and leave. but I couldn't shake the need to see what was back there. When I reached the source of the glow, I found an old refrigerator still plugged in, humming softly against the silence. But when I opened the door, my heart sank. It was empty, gutted, with no shelves, no products, nothing, just an empty shell. As I stood there, staring at the hollow fridge, I heard a noise from the main room, like something had fallen to the floor. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to convince myself that it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to move, stepping back into the main area. Everything was as I left it, empty, silent. But something didn't feel right. My nerves were on edge, every sound amplified in the stillness. I knew I had to get out of there. I hurried back to the entrance, practically jogging the rest of the way to the next shop down the road, which thankfully was open. I grabbed a drink, paid, and rushed back to my truck, not looking back until I was safely inside. But as I sat in the cab, ready to start the engine, I glanced back at the abandoned store. The door, which I was certain I had shut behind me, was now wide open. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Something or someone had opened it. But I wasn't sticking around to find out who or what it was. I started the truck and got back on the road, leaving that eerie place behind me. As I got back on the road, I felt the caffeine starting to do its job, but instead of the usual relief that comes with it, a deep sense of dread settled in. The events at that abandoned stop kept playing over and over in my mind. Something wasn't right, and the feeling of unease only grew stronger with each passing mile. Then, in the rearview mirror, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The curtain behind me in the truck cab was moving. At first, I tried to rationalize it, maybe the wind from the windows, but the windows were shut tight, and the AC was off. There was no logical reason for the curtain to be shifting like that. My heart began to pound in my chest, and a sickening realization hit me. Someone could be in the truck with me. Trying to stay calm, I discreetly searched for the nearest police station on my phone. Each second felt like an eternity as my mind raced through the possibilities. I imagined whoever was back there suddenly lunging at me, grabbing the wheel, or worse. I fought to keep the truck steady, but every small movement in the mirror had me on edge, expecting the worst. After what felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life, I finally saw the lights of the police station up ahead. I pulled into the lot and parked as close to the entrance as I could. My hands were shaking as I practically leaped out of the truck and ran to the station, shouting for help. The officers responded quickly, surrounding the semi with their guns drawn. As they opened the back of the truck, I held my breath, bracing myself for whatever was inside. When the doors swung open, the sight that greeted us will haunt me forever. There, huddled together in the darkness, were two homeless-looking people, one man and one woman. Their clothes nothing more than rags, their faces gaunt and filthy. They were wrapped in old, dirty blankets, staring out at us with hollow eyes. One of the men clutched two switchblades, his knuckles white from the grip. The officers moved in quickly, disarming and cuffing them. But the whole time, they never said a word. They just kept staring at me, their eyes cold and empty, like they were looking right through me. The woman's gaze, in particular, was chilling, her expression devoid of any emotion. I still don't know how long they had been in my truck, or what they were planning to do. Maybe they were just looking for a place to hide, or maybe they had something far more sinister in mind. All I know is that I'll never forget the way they looked at me as the police led them away, those unblinking eyes filled with something dark and unreadable. I never found out what they wanted, and I'm not sure I ever want to. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never stop at a place like that again, and I'll never shake the feeling that they were waiting for the perfect moment to strike, to do something I don't even want to imagine. I've been a trucker for nearly 15 years, hauling goods for different companies all across the country. After all this time, the job has become second nature to me. Pick up the load, check it over, and get it to where it needs to go as fast as possible. Efficiency is key since we get paid by the job, not by the hour. That means I've learned to push myself hard even when I'm running on little to no sleep. 4 years ago, I was working for a warehouse based out of Minnesota. If you've ever driven through Minnesota, you know it's flat as a pancake, which makes trucking a little easier. But easier doesn't mean less work, especially at the start of the week when the warehouse is buzzing with shipments. It was a chilly Thursday in August, and I was staring down a heavy workload. I figured I could get it all done in one shot if I played my cards right. So I mapped out my route into Montana with one goal in mind: drive straight through without stopping to sleep. It was a risky plan, but I had done it before. I told myself I could do it again. I hit the road in the afternoon, determined to make it to Montana by dawn. The first few hours passed uneventfully, the hum of the engine and the stretch of empty highway keeping me focused. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the familiar weight of exhaustion began to creep in. My eyes grew heavy, and I found myself blinking longer than usual, trying to shake off the fatigue. I reached for the small bottle of smelling salts I kept in the cab, something my buddy Robert had introduced me to a few years back. One quick sniff, and the sharp, stinging odor shot straight up my nose, jolting me awake. It worked like a charm, but I knew the effects wouldn't last forever. I kept driving, the road ahead swallowed by darkness, with only my headlights piercing through the night. As the hours dragged on, the struggle to stay awake became harder to ignore. The world outside was just a blur of shadowy trees and endless pavement. I was so focused on keeping my eyes open that when I saw it, I almost didn't believe it. There, in the middle of the road, was a purple dress lying lifelessly on the asphalt. I blinked hard, thinking it was just a trick of my tired mind. But no matter how many times I blinked, the dress remained. My heart rate picked up as I rolled past it, my mind racing to make sense of it. What was a dress doing out here, in the middle of nowhere? And who did it belong to? A little further down the road, I saw something else, a pair of shoes, neatly placed as if someone had just stepped out of them. Then, more clothing scattered across the highway. My grip tightened on the steering wheel as a cold dread settled in. It wasn't just random items. Some of the clothes were small, too small for an adult. They looked like they belonged to children. My mind was screaming at me that something was very wrong. Panic began to bubble up inside me, mixing with the exhaustion, creating a cocktail of fear and confusion. What the hell was happening? And why was I the only one on this stretch of road to see it? I brought the truck to a stop, my heart pounding as I stepped out to investigate, even though every instinct screamed at me to stay inside. The cold night air bit into my skin, sharpening my senses, but it did little to calm the growing dread in my chest. The pile of children's clothes strewn across the road made no sense, and as I stood there, staring down at them, I felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness wash over me. I scanned the woods on either side of the road, trying to see through the inky blackness. Then, I heard it. A soft crunch, like someone stepping on a dry branch coming from the left. My head whipped around, but I saw nothing. Just as I was about to convince myself it was just an animal, another crunch sounded from the opposite side of the road. My heart rate spiked, my breath catching in my throat. And then it happened. A child's scream tore through the still night air, shrill and desperate, freezing me in place. The sound pierced straight through me, sending a wave of terror crashing over me. I was caught between two warring instincts: run back to the truck and get the hell out of there, or rush into the woods to help. My mind raced, trying to process what I'd just heard, and then, before I could decide, another scream rang out, just as blood-curdling as the first. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I jumped back into the truck and turned it on, the headlights cutting through the darkness as I pointed them toward the source of the screams. The beams sliced through the trees, revealing the shadows that lurked within. That's when I saw them. 3 or 4 figures, partially hidden among the trees. One of them was holding something. No, not just something, a massive speaker. My blood ran cold as realization hit me. They were using the speaker to imitate a child's scream, trying to lure me out of my truck and into the woods. The figures ducked behind the trees, avoiding the light, but I'd seen enough. I couldn't believe what was happening. Who were these people? What did they want? Before I could process it, I heard a loud thump on the side of the truck, followed by the sharp sound of glass cracking. Someone had thrown something at the passenger side window, and it had shattered a small part of the glass. My adrenaline kicked in, and without another thought, I floored it. The truck roared back to life as I sped away, my mind reeling from what I'd just witnessed. I drove the final hour in a daze, too terrified to even think about stopping. When I finally reached my destination, I was too exhausted to do anything but collapse into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, I called the police and reported what had happened. They took my statement and promised to investigate. But I never heard anything more. To this day, I have no idea who those people were or what they were planning. Maybe it was some twisted prank, or maybe it was something far more sinister. All I know is that in all my years on the road, nothing has ever come close to terrifying me as much as that night.